Get some more on what's going on. Joining us is the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Adam Schiff of California. Congressman, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
This is the deal. It's about 150 pages. If you go through all the annexes, I assume you've gone through it, you've read it, you've studied it.
Well, I'm just starting to study it, I think, as most of us on the Hill are. It's a lot to go through, and of course, a lot is subject to interpretation. And I just got off the phone before your show with Ambassador Rice to talk about what's between the lines of this agreement. I hope that all of us, and I know this is a bigger hope than the reality, will take the time that this really merits. This is probably one of the most significant votes we're going to have, maybe of the decade. And we ought not to rush to judgment that this is either a really good deal or a really bad deal.
So did Susan Rice, the president's national security advisor, convince you to support the president?
I'm not convinced yet. There's still questions that I want to answer in terms of just how quickly, for example, can we get inspectors to a disputed site? What is the mechanism? Is it really enforceable in terms of snapping back sanctions? Why was it necessary to provide this relief to Iran in terms of its conventional weapons and ballistic missiles? I understand the history, that was part of the nuclear sanctions, but nonetheless it has a very non-nuclear purpose, and I'm sure that was subject to negotiation and debate, and I think that concession is one that troubles many of us.
The deal says to get to a suspected site, if the IAEA wants to go someplace, whether to a military facility or some other facility, the Iranians will have 24 days to consider it before they let anyone go. That's a lot of time, 24 days.
It's a lot of time, particularly if you look at the possible military work that Iran will do on a weapons program. I'm less concerned with the enrichment activity. I think if they're enriching at a hidden site and we get there, whether it's 24 days or more, we have the technologies to be able to detect that. What I'm more concerned about is if they're doing R&D on advanced centrifuges that's not permitted, or if they're doing work on a nuclear detonation device. Those things are more difficult to detect, easier to hide, and that's where those delays could be very critical.
You're on the Intelligence Committee. You're privy to the most sensitive information. Is this the whole deal, what they've released publicly? It's now online. Or are there secret parts of this deal that maybe you would be informed about, but the American public wouldn't?
There are secret aspects about it in terms of some of the protocols that the IAEA may use. And certainly our intelligence capability to divine whether they're complying with the agreement aren't things that are going to be talked about except in the broadest terms in public. So we will be getting classified briefings on this, as well as briefings on what we know of Iranian intentions. Do they intend to comply? Do they intend to cheat? If they are going to cheat, what's the likely method of cheating and where would that occur?
Stand by, Congressman. We have much more to discuss. I've got a lot of technical questions that our viewers are really interested in as well. Much more with Congressman Adam Schiff when we come back. Democrat of the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Adam Schiff. We're talking about the new nuclear deal with Iran, the sharp criticism coming in from some key U.S. allies and from many members of Congress, mostly Republicans, but some Democrats as well. You heard Barbara Starr's report that the Russians now want to go ahead and sell a sophisticated military package to Iran, even in advance of lifting the formal UN arms embargo, supposed to be lifted after 5 years. Conventional weapons. Are the Russians allowed to do that?
I don't think they are allowed to do that, but it's something that the Russians have been threatening to do for some time. So even in the absence of this agreement, they were threatening to sell this system, which is obviously very worrying to us, very worrying to Israel, because should it be necessary to take military action, these are systems that could shoot down our aircraft or Israeli planes.
The deal says that the UN arms embargo for conventional weapons shouldn't be lifted for 5 years. For ballistic missiles, shouldn't be lifted for 8 years. But there's a loophole saying if the Iranians show good behavior, they can be lifted even earlier, both of them. Is that okay with you?
Well, this is a profound concern of mine, and it's something that really wasn't the focus, at least as far as we could tell in Congress, of the negotiations. It seemed to come on the agenda late. I think the Iranians had been raising it from time to time, but it wasn't necessarily a part of this agreement. Iran obviously got this last concession, but it's very worrying because they're going to have tremendous resources now to support their proxies. They have been successful at evading these weapons embargoes nonetheless, but this will now make it legal, much more accessible to get these weapons. There are still embargoes on, for example, they're providing these weapons to the Houthis. There'll still be embargoes against supplying Hezbollah. Those haven't made much difference. Now they'll get greater access to these weapons after 5 years, and they can provide that greater access to these bad actors.
There's the other concern. The Israelis expressed this. A lot of people expressed this concern. They're going to be getting $100 billion, $150 billion in the frozen assets that are lifted, plus billions more in oil exports, which will now be flowing. Iran is a major oil exporter, potentially the fourth largest oil reserves. How worried are you that they'll spend money to promote terrorism, to promote various groups, whether Bashar al-Assad's regime or the Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis, some of these other groups?
I'm very concerned about it. I think the two major downsides of the agreement, then I'll mention the plus side, are first, they'll be armed with all these resources to support all these bad actors in the region. And in terms of Syria, they're hemorrhaging money and getting a lot of their people killed. So this infusion of resources to help Bashar al-Assad. So that's a grave concern, that that's going to just continue to fuel this conflict, as well as destabilize other parts of the region. The other major downside is they remain a threshold nuclear state when this is all said and done. And when that short period in 10 to 15 years isn't very long expires, then they can really gin up their enrichment program. But on the positive side, and again, we have to evaluate this not against an ideal, but against the alternatives. It does mean that Iran is not going to go back to the 20% enriched uranium it had before this negotiation began. It means that the amount of uranium they have on hand is going to be dramatically reduced. The breakup time is going to be dramatically reduced. And the fact of the matter is, even though these sanctions brought Iran to the table, it never stopped Iran's program. So that's what we have to weigh. We have to weigh this against the alternative. And I think that alternative comes down to one of two things: either new sanctions that force Iran back to the table to make new concessions, or Iran that spins up its centrifuges again until we get to a red line, and then you have a likelihood of a military conflict. And
you're confident, and you're a member of the Intelligence Committee, if it comes to that dire scenario, the U.S. using military force to try to destroy Iran's nuclear program, the U.S. has the capability to achieve that goal?
We have the capability to achieve that goal for a period of time. We can't destroy it indefinitely. But I will say this other factor that we have to weigh in the agreement, and that is having these additional inspectors, having them help us identify where they're doing this nuclear work. That would greatly facilitate a military strike if that ultimately became necessary. The
chairman of your committee, the House Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes, he doesn't like this deal. He put out a statement earlier today saying he's got deep, deep concerns about it, as do almost all of the Republicans in the House of Representatives. He's privy to the same intelligence that you are, right?
He is, absolutely.
How good is U.S. intelligence on what Iran is doing right now?
Well, and I think the chairman and my views are frankly based more on our opinions of the likelihood of success of this agreement or failure of the agreement than anything the intelligence can tell us. Our intelligence is pretty good, and certainly better than it has been, but after our disastrous intelligence on Iraq, and in light of the fact that sometimes the cheating we've discovered in Iran hasn't been by virtue of our intelligence, but rather by virtue of opposition groups that have leaked that information, we can't have utter confidence in our ability at any given time to detect exactly what Iran is doing. So there are limits to what we can do. We're a lot better at it than we used to be, but nonetheless, we, I think, need to be circumspect about our ability to know precisely what Iran's doing.
One final question. Was it a mistake for the U.S. not to demand that those 4 American citizens being held prisoner by Iran be released as part of this deal?
All of us would have liked to see these 4 Americans released. I can't say that it was a mistake, because making them part of the negotiation makes them an even bigger bargaining chip in something that ought to be completely unrelated. But I would hope that there's an understanding that this deal hasn't been completed, that these Americans will be released. I hope that's understood.
All of us hope that, indeed. All right, thanks very much, Congressman Schiff, for coming in.